So when the disciples had come together, they asked him, "Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel?" He replied, "It is not for you to know the times or the periods that the Father has set by his own authority. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." Then from Luke chapter 20. They asked Jesus, "Teacher, we know that you are right in what you say and teach, and that you show deference to no one, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose head and whose title does it bear?" They said, "The emperor's." He said to them, "Then give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were not able in the presence of the people to trap him by what he said. And being amazed by his answer, they became silent. Word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The word shrine comes from the Latin word scrinium, meaning box or receptacle, and the idea is that somehow a shrine is a container of sacred meaning, sacred memory, even sacred power. Although shrines can be small enough to be portable, usually they're in fixed locations associated often with natural features as rivers, mountains, or caves. There's a different sort of shrine in an old town in Kent, England called Canterbury. Canterbury is located about an hour southeast of London, almost on the coast, in the heart of what's sometimes called the Garden of England. The habitation goes back to Paleolithic times. It was home to the Roman soldiers from about 43 to 407 AD, and is now one of those unbelievably beautiful, quaint English towns. In fact, so quaint and so beautiful, you think it was done by Disney. It's about as big as Altoona, but has a milder climate and nowhere near as many train tracks. After the Romans left, things deteriorated a bit, but then a young monk named Augustine, not that Augustine, Augustine of Hippo, theologian, but another one, was sent by the Pope in 597 to reestablish Christianity in southern England. By then, the town proper was largely abandoned and only a few farmers remained within the city walls. After his consecration as Bishop of the English, Augustine arrived to Canterbury, founded the abbeys, and established the cathedral, originally called Christ Church. This did wonders for that part of the country, and the town flourished until the Norman invasion in 1066, when it surrendered without a fight. The cathedral burned the next year, but was rebuilt. You might well go to Canterbury as a tourist. There's lots to see and do. The shopping is terrific. The Norman Cathedral still dominates the skyline as you approach the town proper, giving 21st century visitors somewhat the same sense of awe and anticipation as their medieval counterparts. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and also where the head of the Anglican Church, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has a residence when he's not at Weymouth Palace in London. But you might also go to Canterbury not so much as a tourist, but as a pilgrim, as people have done for over 800 years. The city was actually one of the busiest places of pilgrimage in the medieval world. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written about 1392, is a masterpiece of English literature. It describes all sorts of people traipsing along the pilgrim's way to Canterbury to worship and make penance at the tomb of the murdered Archbishop Thomas Becket. Saints are often said to have family resemblances across faiths and across cultures. Generally, a saint might be an exemplary model, an extraordinary teacher, a wonder worker or a source of benevolent power, a noted intercessor. Sometimes one who lives life often refusing material attachments or comforts, or possesses a special and revelatory relation to the holy. Often a saint will be recognized for having many of these. But it isn't often that an insider, an establishment figure, gets to be a saint. So there's got to be a story. Thomas Becket was born in 1118 in London, the child of Norman parents. His father was a successful English merchant who also served as sheriff. Becket benefited from family connections, first by being sent to Paris for school and then back to England to work for Theobald, who was then Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket's own administrative skills, his charm, intelligence, and diplomacy worked to his advantage. The Archbishop sent him back to Paris to study law, and on his return to England made him Archdeacon of Canterbury, which came with an endowment. His big break came in 1154 when Theobald introduced him to the newly crowned king, Henry II. The two hit it off immediately, their similar emotional chemistries forming a strong personal bond between them. Henry named Becket his Chancellor, which equates to Chief Administrative Officer of the realm. This was good because there was a lot of work to do, a lot of money to raise, and Henry had been eyeing increased control over the holdings of the church in England, which were extensive. So when Archbishop Theobald died in 1161, Henry immediately saw the opportunity to increase his influence by naming his loyal advisor to the highest ecclesial post in the land. Henry petitioned the Pope, who agreed, astonishingly. There's only one slight hindrance. Becket, so busy at court, had never actually been ordained. Not a problem. Becket was first invested as a priest on Friday, June 1st, 1162. On Saturday morning, he was made a bishop. And on Saturday afternoon, Archbishop of Canterbury, which is a lot of liturgy in 48 hours. But King Henry believed that having his man at the top post of the church, he could thereby improve his will and his influence upon it. He was sadly mistaken. Something happened to Thomas Becket, and his allegiance began to shift from the court to the church, inspiring him to take a stand against the very man who gave him the job. Becket's story seems shaped by two factors. The first was a background of medieval European dynastic politics. This was a time when rulers sought not only to consolidate their territories against each other, but also to centralize power within their own territories. Personalities figured prominently, and clashes of egos were common. It was also a time when the boundaries of church and state were extremely fluid, as ever. This same medieval world, however, was also one in which insistence upon particular immunities from royal power were becoming more pronounced. Becket, who had been, you remember, fairly well off to begin with, retained many of the habits of a born Londoner. And the inhabitants of that increasingly commercial city passionately believed that they should be governed by themselves, not perpetually beholden to some prince who might happen to own the land on which their houses were built. From this standpoint, the independence of the church that Becket now headed was seen as a proxy for the freedom of other individuals and institutions within the realm. Second background factor for Becket was the movement for reform then sweeping through, that's what the books say, sweeping through, crawling through Europe, perhaps initiated and led by the great Pope Gregory VII and his immediate successors. Reform tried to inculcate ascetic values. It also toughened church discipline against misbehaving priests. It also tried to radically diminish temporal rulers' grip upon matters of church polity. And Becket himself was right in the middle of these changes. As a young man, he'd been somewhat of a clothes horse, like most clergy still are. He'd been a passionate hunter and had no trouble using the sword in defense of King Henry's wishes. Becket's charisma combined these characteristics with a talent for bureaucratic infighting and self-advancement in both ecclesiastical and temporal spheres. He was personally formidable in a time when that mattered. Yet, while exposed to the same temptations as anyone else seeking advancement, the Catholic faith, his history, and teachings were always central to his life. Now, he doesn't seem to have undergone some sort of Damascus Road experience where he's walking along, all of a sudden the heavens part, figure comes down and says, "You, Becket, you're going to be a saint." Nothing like that. But he did seem to start to embrace more ascetic ways and a more pronounced devotional life, which accelerated over time. This went hand in hand with his increasingly vigorous stance against Henry's claim to govern the church as well as the land in accordance with what the king claimed were ancestral customs. In Becket's mind, this wasn't merely a jurisdictional dispute or a turf war. Some of his closest friends were whispering in his ear that the king was going mad. Even so, the Becket-Henry conflict didn't play out as a straight clergy versus royal kind of drama, kind of 12th century Game of Thrones. While Becket found himself arguing with and occasionally excommunicating clergy who took the king's side, he could never take the Pope's backing for granted. Why? The Pope had his own political agenda, and he was constantly being lobbied and sometimes threatened by Henry's other actions. But it also reflected the fact that many church leaders across Europe took seriously legitimate claims of temporal authority and, above all, desired to avoid giving those rulers a reason to draw parts of the church into schism. If it sounds like an invitation to a cultural free-for-all, that's what it was. All right, here's how this all played out. Back then, the church reserved the right to try accused clerics in their own religious councils, in their own religious courts, and not those of the crown. This sounds familiar now, but it goes back at least that far. Henry wanted to increase control of his realm by easing those ties to Rome and by locally weakening clerical independence, including eliminating the custom of church justice for clergy. Well, in 1163, a resident cleric was accused of murder, but acquitted by a church court. There was a public outcry, and the man was brought before a court of the king. Becket's protest halted further action, but the action spurred Henry to change the laws to extend his jurisdiction. Becket vacillated in his support for the king, but finally he refused to agree. His stand got him a royal summons to Henry's court at Northampton to sit down with the king for a little chat. Well, when the chat didn't go the way the king had in mind, he started a line of questioning having to do with what Becket had done with large sums of money that he had control over whilst he was chancellor. Becket was a smart man. He could read the pattern in the royal tapestry, and he fled to France, where he remained in exile for 6 years. Then, however, with help from the Pope, the two former friends appeared to resolve their dispute in 1170 at a meeting in Normandy. In November of that year, Becket returned to his post at Canterbury. But one thing was still unresolved. Whilst he was in France, Becket had excommunicated the bishops of London, and Salisbury and the Archbishop of York. Why? Because they had agreed with the king that the king's heir should be invested at York instead of Canterbury. Even with his reconciliation with Henry, practically the ink still drying on that agreement, Becket remained steadfast in his refusal to change his mind and absolve the bishops. This did not sit well with the king. He flew into a rage in which he was reported to shout, "What sluggards, what cowards have I brought up in my court, who care nothing for their allegiance to their Lord? Who will rid me of this meddlesome priest?" King's exact words have been lost to history, but it doesn't matter. 4 knights of the realm heard him, and they sprung into action. They arrived armed at Canterbury during the afternoon of December 29th and immediately searched for the Archbishop. Becket moved to the cathedral, where a service was in process. The knights found him there on the stairs, heading up toward the altar, and after a shouting match, they drew their swords and killed him. The death of Becket unnerved the king. The knights who took on the task to get the king's favor found themselves out of favor. Several miracles were said to occur at the tomb of the martyr, and hordes of pilgrims started transforming Canterbury Cathedral into a large, beautiful shrine. Geoffrey Chaucer memorialized the thing in the Canterbury Tales. 2 years after his death, he was canonized by Pope Alexander III. 2 years after that, the king, in an act of penance, the king donned sackcloth, walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury, while 80 monks flogged him with branches, and capped his atonement by spending the night in the martyr's crypt. St. Thomas continued as a popular cult figure for the remainder of the Middle Ages. Sadly, the shrine was destroyed in 1538 during the dissolution of the monasteries on orders from King Henry VIII. The king also scattered Becket's bones in order that all mention of his name be obliterated. The pavement where the shrine stood is today marked by a simple table and a candle under a modern representation of the 3 swords that killed him. What we get with Becket is not a saint in the sense the word is often casually used. Instead, Becket is presented as a man who's rather anxious about his middle-class background. He's remarkably quick-tempered, somewhat of a dilettante during his secular career, and who made some really bad moves in his arguments with Henry. But alongside these flaws and errors, he also had extraordinary single-mindedness, a capacity to see through Henry's unending dissimulation, and a remarkable self-mastery in the face of severe intimidation and lethal force. Becket was, there's little doubt, perfectly aware that his insistence upon the church's rightful autonomy was putting his own life in danger. He seemed unsurprised when 4 knights of the realm appeared armed in the courtyard of Canterbury on that cold afternoon of Tuesday, 29 December 1170, and entered the sacred precincts with murder on their minds. I have stood on those steps. I did it before they put in the new shrine and put the table over them. I stood on the same steps where the defender of the church resisted the call of his king to stay true to the call of his God. May Thomas Becket have many imitators. Amen.